Good morning. Walter Anderson grew up very poor and with an alcoholic father. His growing up was not easy, but in the end, he would become the editor of Parade magazine and an incredibly successful man. But he tells about when he was growing up, one of those big steps in his life was as a young man, he became a Marine. He started off as a private, but he was a good leader. And before long, he had that stripe added to his arm there, Lance Corporal. He was so proud. That meant that he had to be officer on duty on Saturday nights. He had to make sure that the barracks were clean, that everything was straightened up, that the Marines were safe, which in some ways was kind of easy on a Saturday night because everybody always went to town. But on this particular Saturday night, he was so very proud about being a Lance Corporal. He walked into the barracks, and as he looked around, there was one young man sitting on the end of his bed reading a letter. Two other young soldiers were there playing cards. That's all that was there. But he went over to the young man reading a letter and he said, "You need to sweep this place down. It needs to be spick and span. Get it ready. You got 15 minutes. And he walked out. You know, being a Lance Corporal, you had authority. You could make things happen. He actually went over back into his own barracks. He's admiring himself in the mirror with his stripe on his shoulder. And then he looked, and it was about 20 minutes. He went back. And when he walked in, the young man was sitting on the end of the bed. He was still reading a letter. The other two men were playing cards. He just kind of walked in, poked out his chest, and a deep voice said, "Well done." He turned to walk out, and he heard some snickering. Two of those Marines, they were laughing. And he knew they were laughing at him. He turned around and said, "What's so funny?" And they said, "Oh, nothing, sir, nothing." And then he looked around and he realized nobody had swept anything down. Nothing had happened. He now went over to this young private sitting there on the end of his bed reading the letter. Then he started screaming at him and cursing at him and telling him he had 5 minutes to sweep this place and get it ready for inspection. And he walked out the door, fuming. He was trying to calm down when he looked back in the window. And he saw that young man was still sitting there on the end of the bed reading a letter. He just lost it. He came storming back in and went over and stood right in front. Again, he was screaming and cursing at him. The young man held up the letter. He simply slapped it out of his hand, and he went on cursing at him until finally this young man looked up at him, and his face was all splotchy and tears were running down his cheek. Walter picked up the letter and began to read it. It turned out it was from a next-door neighbor. To explain to this young man how sorry she was that his mother had died. He hadn't heard. Somehow there was a mix-up in the Marines. He had not received word that his mother had died, and so he never even got to go to the funeral. The funeral was done. She had passed away. He had not known. The letter was coming from a next-door neighbor, not to tell him about his mother dying, but to try to console him. Once Walter understood what was going on, he got the young man up and took him by the arm and led him over to the lieutenant to tell him what had happened, and from there he took him to the chaplain. And as he's walking towards the chaplain, Walter said, "I'm really so sorry for screaming at you." And the young man said, "It's all right, sir. I don't think I heard anything you had to say." He got over to the chaplain, he turned around and he shook hands with Walter and said, "Thank you so much for helping me." Walter went back and he went to the barracks himself, and now he straightened up the young man's footlocker. He swept the place down. He turned out the lights and he went back to his own barracks. And that night he said he learned something. He learned rather than screaming at people, you need to listen. Because if you listen, you can learn what's going on in people's lives. And then he said, it's so much easier to help them and to love them. Maybe rather instead of screaming at people, you and I need to make a commitment. We're going to spend more time listening. Because if we listen, it is so much easier to help and to love those who are around us. Have a great day.